Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And today we're going to be talking about what I feel is a very different and a very exciting book. It is called Facing the Wave, A Journey in Wake of the Tsunami. The author, Gretel Ehrlich, has been nice enough to stop by, and her publisher is Pantheon Books. Welcome.
Thank you.
I think I should make clear that the tsunami that we're talking about is the one that hit the northeast coast of Japan on March 11th, 2011, just a little over 2 years ago. And you went to the site of that disaster, I think in June, or so it suggests.
In June, for the first time.
Yeah. And you are a student of the poetry of Japan, its theater and art. And
yes.
and don't deny this now. You have many friends in Japan?
Well, I have some. I wouldn't say many, but I have some.
Okay. And even
I've been there many times. So, since 1968.
Mm-hmm. But somewhere in the book, I think I read that despite all of that, background and interest with Japan, you're not really sure why you wanted to make this particular trip.
Well, only in the sense that when you suddenly feel compelled to do something, you don't sit around and philosophize why you're doing it. You just do it,
You just up and go.
Yeah. Yeah, I just, felt this strong affinity with Japan and Japanese people, and I'd been on that coast before. I'm also, a reader of Matsuo Basho, the 17th century poet whose fifth travel diary called Oku no Hosomichi took him up that very coast. And, it kind of built up into this feeling that I just had to go. I also heard, on the news that people were hungry, and the towns from Sendai north, towns and villages and little harbors for 375 miles were just erased. It's not like there was just a few houses here and there. The entire towns are just gone, and much of the population in those towns were lost.
There were many moments in the book where you try to sum up what has happened, and one of them that I found quite apt is you say boundaries between living and dying have been erased by water. What a thought. And there are other places in the book where water takes on a power and a force that we don't, or I don't usually think of. I mean, yeah. I think of water as refreshing and revitalizing and all that kind of stuff.
But when you, in these towns, depending on how they were configured topographically, the run-up heights of the tsunami waves were as high as 133 feet in the town of Miyako. Other towns it was 50 or 60 or 75 feet. But that's, like having a whole row of buildings coming at you. It was just immense. And yet, when I went in June, you look out at the ocean, it looks calm and beautiful, and it's kind of astonishing how much it can change in a very short period of time.
Yeah, and the power, in a way, can be sensed by the numbers. 19,000 killed, 300,000...
Well, actually, way more than that. The numbers are all wrong in the U.S. But anyway, more. It was more like 28,000, and there's still many, many thousands missing.
Wow. I just read the 19,000 this week because there was an article in the paper marking the anniversary. Right.
That's wrong. At least according to I just had my interpreter call the police department in Sendai, and they gave us much higher numbers.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, it doesn't matter. There are a lot of people died. What makes this perhaps more distinctive in a certain way is that Japan is a thoroughly developed country, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And the buildings are earthquake-proof, and people are very savvy about tsunamis and earthquakes and what to do and where to go.
And there are devices to warn people of an oncoming tsunami.
Excuse me?
There are devices to warn people about an oncoming tsunami?
Oh yeah, there were.
Oh.
Yes, they have tsunami warning sirens, but these waves were so huge, and in villages where there's steep mountains close by, most people could get up to the top of a hill quickly, but
Mm-hmm.
Farther south by Sendai, the Sendai Plain, which is mostly rice fields, people were just washed away because there was no high ground. So they went to, the third story of a school building or a city building, and were still washed away in many places. So they had never seen, people just hadn't seen waves that big. It turned out that it was really two seismic ruptures that displaced water simultaneously, and those sort of bodies of displaced water came together rather quickly, and so the wave kind of was much bigger than it might have been.
Facing the wave is much more than a statistical kind of analysis of what happened in March 2011. It shares the stories of many real people, and we'll get to some of them when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Facing the Wave, A Journey in the Wake of the Tsunami by Gretel Ehrlich. That's the book we're talking about today. And as we ended the first segment, we promised you that we would get to some of the stories behind the horrible facts of all this. And the New York Journal of Books put it this way: each of the people in this book has a different story about the wave, which Miss Ehrlich gathers into a collage of survivor and eyewitness accounts sprinkled with testimony from people who simply came home to find their world gone. That's really what happened to so many of them. One of the things that I wanted to ask you is in regard to collecting the facts, in regard to getting the stories right about the role of your friend Masumi. Did she help you a lot, and were there other people? How did you go about this? I mean, it seems like you keep getting transported around to all the quote right unquote places, and you make it sound. You make.
Well, I had two different interpreters.
Uh-huh.
One was Masumi, who I just kind of inherited from another Japanese friend up in Hokkaido.
Mm-hmm.
There was sort of no place to stay, so I ended up living with Masumi and her parents. So I became part of the family. And it turned out that her entire extended family were rice farmers, all of whom lost their houses, their fields, their tractors, their cars, everything.
Oh,
they all survived, some just barely, but they lost everything. So they just automatically became part of the story. It was nothing planned. It just happened that way. The other set of people who helped me were a little farther north. Nikki, who's half New Zealander and half Japanese, and the driver Abe-san, who was from the Tohoku area.
Mm-hmm.
And he drove us around in his dilapidated hippie van, and we just
very well described in the book.
All kinds of people. It was really great.
Oh, good. It's interesting that you have Tsunami telling her own experience of the storm. I saw waves coming. I saw my uncle's rice fields disappear and the trees at the coast break in half. I saw where water had pushed my grandmother's house until it came apart. I saw the roof floating. That's unbelievable. To me, it is. But that's what you saw all over the place.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. One fisherman said he was sort of dove into the water looking for his boat. This was, months afterwards, and he saw two entire houses completely intact at the bottom of the ocean.
Oh.
It was kind of, there were moments, especially that Masumi and I just pulled off the road and laughed. I mean, that kind of laugh of disbelief and grief and this sort of wild hilarity that how could things look like this? And you go through the little towns and there was rubble 2 stories high where a bulldozer gone through and just, cleared a lane for people to get through. But it was this indelible collage of a world that had been mastered into other forms.
Speaking of things unbelievable, I think one of the things to me that was unbelievable is the story of the Ukawa Elementary School, which was built in the wrong place, set in a narrow floodplain between a wide river held by a levee and an almost vertical forested hill. It's said that after the quake, the teachers stood in the playground for 20 minutes and argued about where to take the children.
Yeah, well, they took the children to a slight hill, but it wasn't high enough.
Uh-huh.
And they they were kind of arguing, and the one teacher who went up the very steep hill with one student being bold enough to follow her survived, but she later committed suicide because 10 out of the 11 teachers drowned, and 75 children were washed away.
Oh my! The story that was, I think, the easiest for me to follow is the story of the fisherman and his son. Can you tell me that?
Yeah, they were really great. Yeah, we just met them by accident. We were just standing at what had been a port, a fishing processing center, and they glided in their boat, and they just talked to us. And so, everybody had to face the wave, but the fishermen all tried to get to their boats and drive them out over the incoming wave, because any boat that was left in the harbor was just tumbled and crushed and thrown up into trees, and they knew the boat wouldn't survive.
So that
they drove it out over this huge, 100-foot wave, the two of them, and they went out and to an area they thought was far enough out, and they looked out at sea, and they saw even more waves coming, so they went even farther out with no warm clothes. It was snowing, no food, nothing. And they finally got out far enough. There were just a few other boats out there, and they stayed there for 2 days, because when they looked back at their village with binoculars, they saw everything was gone. And, it's a fearful thing to go home, even though their families did survive. But that sort of horrible moment of not knowing was kind of paralyzing.
Of the many stories in Facing the Wave, perhaps the most significant is the one about the power plants and radiation. We're going to talk about that when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Gretel Ehrlich is the guest today on Conversations on the Coast. Her book is called Facing the Wave, A Journey in the Wake of the Tsunami, and it's published by Pantheon Books. And Book List had some interesting things to say. Gifted, adventurous, and extolled nature writer. I've never had an extolled nature writer on this program before, Gretel, so thank you for coming. Has abiding...
My bell has been rung many times.
Has a biting connection to Japan, so she returned there soon after the March 2011 earthquake and tsunami. Ehrlich's invaluable chronicles subtly raises questions about coastal disasters, global warming, nuclear power, as the beauty and precision of her prose and her profound and knowledgeable insights into nature's might and matters spiritual and cultural evoke a deep state of awe and sympathy. That's one hell of a sentence, but it says what's true about the book. I congratulate you on it. I'd like to understand a little bit more about a tsunami wave before we get to what's going on now. And I think I have a good place here on page 67 in the section called Two Waves. A tsunami wave is born from displacement, you say, not wind, and does not travel over the ocean's surface, but rises suddenly from the rupture zone and drags bottom all the way to shore. And as it comes into shallow water, the wave mounds up, and its height increases dramatically. And I guess that's why if you're in charge of a boat, you try to get into it, because as it hits shore, it can do the most damage?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. No hope for any boats that were left behind.
The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power complex supplied electricity to a lot of people in Japan. It was severely damaged by the tsunami, knocked out actually, and then became the subject of a lot of lies, I think.
Yes.
That it wasn't as bad as people thought it was, and it would soon come back online, and it's not back online as we speak, is it?
Oh, no, it will never be back online, no. No, there were 4 meltdowns. The 4 reactors there are completely melted down. It will be, they said, decades before they can even be dismantled or whatever it is they do with places that, have been melted down. But, I mean, I think the salient fact for me was that the entire complex was in a state of disrepair, that they had cooling systems. What failed were the cooling systems simply because the backup generators, which were up a hill, which were safe from the rather small tsunami wave that hit there, were not waterproof. So it all kind of just came apart suddenly. The other thing was that the workers said that even before the wave hit the plant, because of the earthquake, the pipes were coming off the walls were crumbling, oxygen tanks were exploding. So what that really meant was that the plant was not being taken care of properly in the first place. And then when the wave came on top of that, it disabled the cooling systems, which would have prevented the meltdowns. So then, of course, to save face, so to speak, both the government and TEPCO, which is Tokyo Electric, lied about what had happened. They said, the tsunami, ruined everything so that they wouldn't be blamed for negligence. And then they were trying to prevent, I guess, sort of mass hysteria. And, they kind of quickly evacuated people, but not far enough. These are people that it's important to know that south of Sendai, the houses were not washed away. They were just severely radiated. So those are different kinds of refugees. and they were, taken farther and farther back. The greatest concern is about the children because they're at the greatest risk for thyroid cancer and other kinds of cancers, leukemia. Because their tissue, the radiation goes right through your tissue, and of course, children's bodies are fragile, and so that's of great concern for them. And because they were lied to, perhaps they didn't get far enough away. But I must say that the airborne radiation during the meltdowns went all over the place because it was carried by the spring winds, so that when it was carried west, it hit the spine of the mountains and fell down in the mountains. When it went south, it hit buildings in Tokyo, and there are hot spots in Tokyo because of that. And at the same time, radiated water was and probably still is leaking into the Pacific, and it's been called the greatest marine radiation disaster in history.
Wow. And you yourself were exposed.
Yes, but I'm old, and I was 100 miles at Sendai is about 100 miles north, and I went north from there.
I see.
Because my interpreters are young women, and I didn't want to expose them,
Sure.
And they didn't want to go. I went for about half an hour close by to see some animal rescue people, but that was it.
In addition to response to the radiation issue, the radiation cleanup, if you will, something else is going on over there called rebuilding. How is that going on?
Well, there is no real rebuilding. What happened? So first people were put in evacuation centers and school gyms. Then the government built kind of rows of apartments in a barrack-like structures that are about 350 square feet. That's for like a family of 4 people.
Oof.
So very confining. And the next step is that the government is buying land for family and neighborhood groups, but the people themselves have to pay for their own housing, houses to be rebuilt. They have to rebuild on higher ground. They can't rebuild where the tsunami came. So
I'm sorry to say
kind
that
of at a plateau. Yeah.
I'm sorry to say that the next step for us is to say goodbye. We've been talking today to Gretel Ehrlich about her new book, Facing the Wave, A Journey in the Wake of the Tsunami. And she doesn't want to say goodbye. She wants to say sayonara. So we will. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.